The night seemed to carry all the fury of the sky. Lightning flashed through the darkness, and the rain fell so hard that each drop felt like a blow to the earth. Javier, a boy of only 13, huddled under the awning of an abandoned building, trying in vain to protect himself from the cold that cut into his bones. His worn clothes were completely soaked, and his empty stomach growled as if it were part of the storm. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the chaos around him, when an unexpected sound broke the heavy silence of the night. A high-pitched, desperate scream echoed in the darkness. Javier jumped, his heart racing. He knew the streets well, and this scream was not something one heard without reason. The city at night was dangerous, and the alleys hid more threats than refuge. The sound came from a nearby alley, a place Javier knew he should avoid. Every instinct screamed at him to stay where he was, but something in that voice made him hesitate. It was a different sound, filled with despair, as if the person who made it was holding on to life by a thread. He took a deep breath, fighting the fear that was rising inside him. "Why should I care?" he thought, as his gaze remained fixed on the dark alley. But before he could bring himself to stay, his feet began to move. An invisible impulse, perhaps a spark of compassion he hadn't even known still existed, pushed him toward danger. With each step, the sound of the rain seemed louder, drowning out the noise of the city. The darkness seemed to swallow all the light as Javier entered the alley. The air was cold. The smell of garbage and stagnant water was suffocating. He could barely see. But then his eyes caught sight of something on the ground, a motionless figure. It was a man, lying in a puddle of dirty water, his body trembling slightly. Javier stopped, his thoughts racing faster than his heart. This could be a trap, he thought. He had seen terrible things happen on the street before. But something about the man, maybe the way he was groaning in pain, made him take a step forward. "Sir, are you okay?" Javier asked, his voice low and hesitant. The man raised his head with effort, and his eyes met Javier's. They were eyes filled with pain, fear, but also something else, hope. "Please, help me," the man said, in a barely audible voice. And it was at that moment that Javier realized he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. Javier swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. He looked so fragile, so out of place in that pool of cold, dirty water. The boy hesitated. Everything in him screamed to turn around and run. Help and kindness were not things you saw often on the streets, and often helping someone was the same as getting yourself into trouble. I don't know what to do," Javier murmured, more to himself than to the man. The man groaned softly, his hands shaking as he tried to move, but the effort seemed to cause him excruciating pain. He was holding his right leg tightly, and even through the rain, Javier could tell something was wrong. It felt dislocated, maybe broken. "Please, don't leave me here," the man begged, his voice hoarse with desperation. I can't move." Javier took a step forward, water soaking through his worn sneakers. He looked around, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The alley was deserted, with no sign of help or immediate danger. Just him, the man, and the relentless rain that seemed to intensify the weight of the scene. "Okay, I'll help," he finally said, more firmly than he had expected. He knelt down beside the man, ignoring the cold water that was now soaking his pants. "What's your name?" Javier asked, trying to sound confident even as his hands shook. Ramon Garcia," the man replied between groans of pain. Javier nodded, taking a deep breath to keep himself calm. He had never helped anyone like this before, but something inside him told him that he couldn't just abandon this man. He started searching for something in Ramon's pockets, hoping to find a phone, a signal that they could call for help. "My phone, in my coat," Ramon said, pointing with difficulty to the left side of his body. With trembling fingers, Javier found the phone. It was a simple model, but it seemed intact, even after so much time in the rain. He unlocked the device and quickly dialed the emergency number. "Please, send help," he said, trying to control the panic in his voice. "We're in an alley near San Andres Street. A man is injured. I think he broke his leg." On the other end of the line, the operator answered calmly, but Javier could barely hear. The rain and Ramon's moans seemed to drown out everything. He hung up after confirming the address, feeling the weight of what was happening. "They're coming," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Just hold on a little longer, Mr. Ramon." Ramon. He looked at Javier with a mixture of pain and gratitude. He didn't understand why this boy, who was clearly also struggling to survive, was there by his side, helping him. You're brave," Ramon murmured, his voice breaking. Javier didn't know how to respond. He didn't feel brave. In fact, he was terrified. The distant sound of a siren cut through his thoughts, bringing with it a wave of relief. Help was on the way, but little did he know that this would only be the beginning of something much bigger. The sound of the siren grew louder, closer and closer, until red and blue lights began to illuminate the entrance to the alley. Javier felt a pang of relief, but also a new wave of uncertainty. He was used to avoiding any kind of authority, be it police or paramedics. Their world wasn't his, and any interaction always ended badly for someone like him. But this time was different. He needed to stay. Ramon needed him. The ambulance stopped abruptly, and two paramedics ran toward the alley with a stretcher. Javier stepped back slightly, giving them space to reach Ramon. "What do we have here?" one of the paramedics asked as he knelt down beside Ramon. "He fell. I think he broke his leg," Javier said, his voice shaking. "He couldn't move, and the rain made it worse." The paramedics began to examine Ramon carefully, exchanging serious glances as they assessed his injury. "It looks like a broken hip," one of them said to his colleague. "Let's stabilize him and get him to the hospital." As they worked, Ramon squeezed Javier's hand, who was still kneeling next to him. His eyes, filled with pain, searched the boys. Don't leave me," he said, almost in a whisper. "Please, don't leave me alone." Javier went still. He wanted to say that everything would be okay, that Ramon was safe now, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He had never been needed by anyone before. No one had ever held his hand like that, as if his presence actually mattered. "Okay, I'll stay," Javier finally said, his voice firmer than he expected. The paramedics lifted Ramon onto the stretcher, and he cried out in pain as they moved. Javier instinctively reached out to hold Ramon's hand, even though he wasn't sure if it would help. As the paramedics began to push the stretcher toward the ambulance, Ramon grabbed one of their arms. "Please, the boy. He needs to come with me," Ramon begged, his voice weak but urgent. The paramedic hesitated, looking at Javier. He looked surprised, maybe even suspicious. "Do you want to go?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Javier looked at the ambulance, at the stretcher, and then at the dark alley behind him. The cold still bit into his skin, and the sound of the rain continued to echo around him. He had never climbed into an ambulance before, never even imagined that someone would want him with him. But Ramon wanted him. Ramon needed him. "Yes, I will," he replied, his voice more certain this time. The paramedics helped Javier into the ambulance. He sat down next to Ramon, who held out his hand again. Javier hesitated for a moment, but then took his hand. That simple gesture seemed loaded with meaning, something Javier couldn't explain, but felt deeply. "Thank you," Ramon said with difficulty. "I couldn't have done it without you." The ambulance began to move, rocking gently as it passed through the dark, rain-soaked streets. Javier looked outside, watching the city lights flicker through the fogged-up windows. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he was in the right place. And then Ramon spoke again, his voice weak, but filled with an intensity Javier had never heard before. "You don't know this yet, kid, but I think fate brought us together tonight." Javier looked at him, confused, unsure of how to respond. But something inside him told him that somehow Ramon was right. The sound of the ambulance siren was like a constant wail that echoed through the dark streets. Javier remained silent, holding Ramon's hand, his skin feeling cold and trembling slightly. It was a strange touch for him. No one had held his hand since, well, he couldn't even remember. Human contact was a luxury that life on the streets rarely allowed. Ramon lay on the stretcher, breathing hard. His face was pale, lined with pain, but his eyes were fixed on Javier. "You look scared, kid," Ramon murmured, his voice weak but full of concern. Javier blinked, surprised by the question. No one ever cared about how he felt. He tried to shrug, but the truth slipped out before he could contain it. "It's nothing, I just don't know why I'm here. I'm nobody. And you don't even know me." Ramon smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "You're someone, kid. If you weren't, you wouldn't have stopped to help. Believe me, that says a lot more about you than you know." Javier looked away, feeling his face heat up. He didn't know how to respond to that. He was used to harsh words and looks of contempt, not praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, almost in a whisper. Ramon squeezed Javier's hand lightly, a small gesture, but one that seemed to carry a lot of weight. "No, kid, not just anyone. Most would have walked right past. Not you. And that's why I'm here, holding your hand, trusting you." The ambulance rocked as it rounded a bend, and Javier looked out, seeing the city lights flashing past the windows. A lump formed in his throat. It was hard to believe that in all this darkness, he could be the reason someone still had hope. "What were you doing in that alley?" Javier asked, more to divert the subject than out of curiosity. Ramon sighed, closing his eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to answer. "I was going home. My mind was elsewhere. I didn't see the hole in the sidewalk until it was too late. It seems fate had other plans for me tonight." Javier nodded, trying to process the words. The man seemed so different from the people he usually met on the streets. There was something about him, a deep sadness, but also an unexpected kindness. "Do you have a family?" Javier asked, without thinking much. There was a heavy silence before Ramon answered. His voice was low, heavy with pain. "I did. My wife. She passed away many years ago. And my son, too. Ever since then, I've been alone." Ramon's words hit Javier like a punch in the gut. He knew that feeling of loneliness, of loss. But hearing it come from someone like Ramon, who seemed so different from the world he knew, was something he hadn't expected. "I don't have anyone either," Javier confessed, his voice barely audible. "My parents, they're gone. And now, it's just me." Ramon opened his eyes, staring at Javier. He squeezed the boy's hand a little tighter, as if trying to convey something that words couldn't. "I'm sorry, kid. No child should have to go through this." Javier just nodded, feeling the tears welling up in his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, But something about that night was breaking down all the barriers he'd built to protect himself. Finally, the bright lights of the hospital came into view, and the ambulance pulled up. The paramedics opened the doors, and Ramon was carefully lifted off the stretcher. Before they wheeled him inside, Ramon looked at Javier one more time, his eyes filled with something the boy couldn't quite decipher. "Don't leave me now, kid. I need you." Javier took a deep breath, still unsure of what he was doing here, but he answered with a firmness that surprised him. "I'm not going anywhere." As they walked through the hospital hallways, Javier felt that somehow the strange man and the chaotic night had become more than just a coincidence. Maybe fate really did have a plan for them. The hospital was lit by a cold, artificial light. The white walls seemed even more sterile, under the glare of the spotlights, and the smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Javier walked side by side with Ramon's gurney, trying to ignore the curious glances of the people crossing the hallway. He didn't belong here, but something kept him there. Maybe it was the way Ramon looked at him, as if Javier were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. They reached a room where the nurses transferred Ramon to a hospital bed. He groaned in pain, but managed to mumble a "thank you" before closing his eyes, exhausted. One of the nurses asked Javier to wait in the hallway while they tended to the patient. The boy sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs, staring at the floor. He was tired, soaked, and hungry. All he wanted to do was disappear right now. But before he could get lost in his thoughts, a nurse opened the door and waved him in. "Ramon wants to talk to you," she said with a gentle smile. Javier hesitated, but got up and walked into the room. Ramon was lying on the bed, still pale, but with a calmer expression. When he saw Javier, his eyes lit up. "You came," Ramon said, as if he wasn't sure the boy would answer. "Of course I did," Javier replied, trying to sound confident, though he was still unsure. Ramon held out his hand, and Javier stepped closer, taking it gently. Ramon's hand felt warmer now, less fragile. "Listen, kid," Ramon began, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want you to go back to the streets. I want you to stay with me." Javier blinked, unsure. Understand what he was hearing. He let go of Ramon's hand, taking a step back. "What? Why?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "You don't even know me. I'm just a street kid." Ramon smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "That's exactly why, Javier. Because I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like no one cares. You helped me today, when no one else would have. That says a lot about you." Javier shook his head, trying to process those words. He was used to rejections, to closed doors. This offer seemed unreal, impossible. "But I don't know how to live outside the streets. What if I'm not what you expect?" he asked, his voice shaking. Ramon squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, as if gathering strength, and then spoke firmly. "You're already more than I could ever hope for, Javier. It's not about what you know now. It's about what you can become. I want to give you a chance. Not just because you helped me, but because I see something in you. Something special." Javier felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to believe those words, but fear held him back, like invisible chains. Ramon seemed to sense the boy's inner struggle, and continued, "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. I want you to know that whatever you choose, you won't be alone anymore." The words hit Javier like a wave. For the first time in years, someone was offering him something that wasn't old food or pitying looks. It was a chance, a choice. He didn't know if he was ready to accept it, but something inside him was starting to warm up, like a shy light, trying to break through the darkness. I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice breaking. Ramon smiled and nodded. "That's all I ask." The nurse came in again, telling him that Ramon needed to rest before being taken into surgery. Javier left the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened that night. He looked down the hallway in front of him and realized that for the first time, it didn't just look like a straight line of uncertainty. There was something more there, a possibility, a path he never thought he would take. And as he sat back down in the hallway, still shivering from cold and exhaustion, Javier realized that perhaps fate had given him a choice. The next few days passed in a blur for Javier. Ramon underwent surgery to repair the fracture, and the doctors said he would be fine, but would need a long recovery. Javier stayed by his side, not knowing exactly why. He still felt like he didn't belong there, but every time Ramon looked at him, there was something in his eyes that made Javier believe, if only for a moment, that he mattered. One afternoon, while Ramon was resting, a man came into the hospital room. He was impeccably dressed, in a tailored suit, holding a briefcase. His expression was serious but friendly. "Ramon, it's good to see you're recovering," he said, approaching the bed. "I'm Pedro, your lawyer. You asked me to come." Ramon nodded, smiling weakly. "Yes, Pedro. I want to talk to you about something important." The lawyer pulled up a chair and sat next to Ramon, but his eyes soon turned to Javier, who was sitting in the corner of the room, curled up in a chair. Pedro smiled slightly. "And this must be the Javier you told me about." Javier's eyes widened in surprise. Ramon had told a lawyer about him. "Yeah, it's me," the boy mumbled, still not understanding what was happening. Ramon took a deep breath and looked at Pedro. "I want to make sure that if something happens to me, Javier is protected. I want him to have a home, that he doesn't have to go back to the streets." Pedro frowned slightly, leaning forward. "Ramon, you understand that this isn't simple, right? Javier is a minor, and the legal issues surrounding custody are complicated, especially considering his health condition." "I know, Pedro," Ramon replied firmly, "but I'm not going to give up on him. I want to do whatever it takes to make sure he has a chance at life." Javier felt a lump in his throat. He'd never heard anyone talk about him like that, like he was important, like he deserved to be protected. "Why would you do that?" Javier asked, his voice shaking. "I'm just a street kid. I have nothing to offer." Ramon turned to him, his eyes full of determination. "You gave me something no one else did, Javier. You gave me hope. That's more than enough." Pedro watched the two of them in silence for a moment, then stood up. "Okay, let's do this the right way. I'll start preparing the paperwork and contacting social services. Ramon, this will take time and effort, but I believe we can build a strong case." Ramon nodded, his face resolute. "Do it. Whatever it takes, Pedro. No matter what it takes." In the days that followed, Javier watched his life turn upside down. Social workers began visiting them, asking questions about his past, his life on the streets, and his connection to Ramon. He was nervous at each interview, worried that one wrong answer would ruin everything. Ramon, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, always assuring Javier that everything would be okay. Finally, Pedro arrived with news. "We've managed to schedule a hearing with the judge. It'll be next week. We're going to present our case and fight for Ramon to have custody of Javier." Javier felt his heart race. He knew the hearing was his chance to change everything, but he also knew that if he failed, he'd be back on the streets. "What if the judge says no?" Javier asked, his voice thick with concern. Pedro put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen." But most of all, Javier, I need you to be honest. Tell your story. Talk about what you've been through and what you want for your future. That's what will touch the judge's heart." Javier nodded, trying to gather his courage. He didn't know what the future held, but there was one thing he was sure of. He was no longer alone. Ramon and Pedro were by his side, and that was more than he ever expected. The battle had only just begun, but Javier was willing to fight for something he never imagined he could have: a home. The day of the hearing came like a sudden blow. Javier's palms felt sweaty and his heart pounding as he waited in the hallway of the courthouse with Ramon and Pedro. He was dressed in new clothes that Ramon had provided, something that seemed so out of place in his life that it only increased his anxiety. "Are you ready?" Ramon asked, sitting next to him. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern. Javier took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so," he replied, though his voice betrayed nervousness. Pedro appeared in the hallway, nodding encouragingly. "It's time. Let's go." They entered the courtroom, a large, intimidating space with the judge seated behind a raised desk. Javier's legs felt shaky as he sat down next to Ramon, but the steady, reassuring gaze of the man beside him helped him maintain his composure. The judge began by reviewing Pedro's documents and listening to his opening arguments. Then his attention turned to Javier. "Javier, I'd like to hear your story. Can you tell me about yourself?" the judge asked, his voice gentle but firm. Javier looked at Ramon, who nodded encouragingly. He took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in his voice. "I lived on the streets for a long time," he began hesitantly. "I lost my parents when I was little. Ever since then, it's been just me, trying to survive. But that night, when I met Mr. Ramon, everything changed." He told the story in a shaky but honest voice, from the moment he heard the scream in the alley to Ramon's words in the ambulance. Javier spoke of the unexpected kindness he had received, of how Ramon saw something in him that no one else had. "I don't know what my life would be like if I hadn't met Mr. Ramon. He gave me hope, something I hadn't felt in years." When he finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge looked at Ramon. "Mr. Garcia, what motivates you to want custody of Javier?" Ramon shifted in his chair, taking a deep breath before answering. "Your Honor, I lost my wife and son years ago, and that left me with a void that I tried to fill with work and loneliness. When Javier came into my life that night in the alley, I saw something in him, a kindness and courage that I hadn't seen in a long time. He helped me when no one else would have. And now, all I want is to give him a chance at a life that I never had the chance to give my own son." The judge listened in silence, considering his words. After a few moments, he spoke. "This is an unusual case, but it's clear that there is a genuine bond between the two of you. And it's clear to me that Javier's best interests will be served under Ramon Garcia's tutelage." Javier froze, the judge's words echoing in his mind. He looked at Ramon, who had tears in his eyes, but was smiling broadly. Pedro nodded, confirming that everything had worked out. I'm staying?" Javier asked, almost in disbelief. "Yes, you are staying," the judge replied with a gentle smile. Unable to contain himself, Javier hugged Ramon, feeling a wave of emotions wash over him: relief, happiness, hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he finally had a place in the world. In the days that followed, life began to take on a new shape. Javier enrolled in school, and Ramon, even in recovery, made sure to be present every step of the way. Ramon's house, which where once it was an empty, lonely space, it was now full of life. Javier, who had lived without a home for so long, finally felt like he belonged somewhere. One afternoon, Javier hung a drawing on one of the walls of Ramon's house, an image of two birds flying together in the sky. It was simple, but full of meaning. "What do you think?" he asked, looking at Ramon, who was looking at the drawing. Ramon smiled, his eyes full of pride. "It's perfect, kid. It represents exactly who we are now, a family. And so, with a home full of hope and the warmth of a new connection, Javier and Ramon began a new chapter in their lives. They both knew that the future would bring challenges, but they were also certain of one thing. No matter what happened, they would always have each other. Did you like this story? Leave your comment below and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next inspiring stories.